I just turned 40, and I had this kind of a midlife crisis moment, and maybe 40 is too early for midlife, and I don't want to be an experimental psychologist. I want to do history, and that's all I want to do.
You just heard Ludy Benjamin, Professor Emeritus from Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. Garth and Jane Halonen interviewed Ludy as part of the PsychSessions 2023 East Coast Tour for episode 179 of PsychSessions, Conversations About Teaching and Stuff.
PsychSessions is proud to partner with Macmillan Learning. At Macmillan Learning Psychology, content matters, and these days, digital content matters more than ever. Macmillan Learning's Achieve elevates interactive teaching and learning with an extraordinary range of online course content in a powerful yet easy-to-use platform. Interactive ebooks, innovative assessments, engaging videos and activities, helpful instructor resources. Achieve brings it all together and makes it easy for you to find what you need and what you want. See for yourself. Go to macmillanlearning.com/PsychSessions for an introductory tour today. Macmillan's Achieve for Psychology, engaging every student, supporting every instructor, setting the new standard for teaching and learning. The PsychSessions podcast is sponsored by STP. That is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. You can find them at teachpsych.org. The views or product endorsements expressed do not represent the views, support, or endorsements of STP. PsychSessions is so grateful to have STP as a long-term supporter. Hi, this is Garth. Jane Halonen and I had the opportunity in June of 2023 to go interview Ludy Benjamin, and Jane is with us today for this introduction. Hi, Jane.
Hi.
This is your pal. Can you just tell us a little bit about how did we get Ludy Benjamin on the PsychSessions podcast?
Yes, I can. It was 5 years in the making because he has been the most reluctant, resistant target for PsychSessions. And fortunately for us, he held out to inspire us to do this greatest of all time tour. And so his resistance allowed us to go visit him in Virginia and learn about his background. He's a legendary teacher focused on the history of psychology and also has made just extraordinary contributions to high school teaching, and in fact was one of the instrumental people involved in setting up advanced placement. So a great person to talk to.
Well, and Jane, I want to thank you because you're instrumental in this interview, not only because you conduct most of the interview, but because you have this personal and longstanding relationship with Ben that had made it possible for us to get this. And I always love at the end of these interviews when people maybe he didn't say it's not so bad, but I actually think he enjoyed himself at the end of this interview. So I think it was a success. What do you think?
I think so too. In fact, because I had an opportunity to visit with him and Priscilla, I just kept thinking, damn, I wish the recorder were on, because he leaks great stories. And I think if we ever go back to him and say time for round 2, he'd probably readily agree. So that feels like a major accomplishment.
Well, folks, this is a little longer than a typical PsychSessions episode, but we're not editing anything because Jane's right. The stories are just too good that Ben tells. And there is bonus content beyond this, actually, when the mics were officially turned off, but still rolling. He told some great stories, and those will be coming out somehow, some way. I think those were stories about, do you remember who those stories were about?
I think we should just tease the audience and say it's well worth listening.
Very good. All right, Jane, it was a pleasure to be on this trip with you and to do this interview. And so now, folks, here is Ludy Benjamin. I am here in Charlottesville, Virginia, with my co-host for a road trip, Jane Halonen. That's Jane S. Halonen. And we are here at the home of Ludy Benjamin. And Jane, do you want to just introduce your friend, your long-term friend and pal, Ludy, here that we're sitting across from?
I'm happy to, in part because Ben has been the most elusive of PsychSessions interviewees. We've been after him for as long as you've been trying to make podcasts. And so we almost had landed him, and then COVID hit. And then we did get him to agree to this.
The money was never right.
It never is for this podcast.
And it still won't be. So I think we just wore you down. Ben is a legendary teacher of psychology. He's probably won every award available to anyone who teaches psychology, and has made a huge impact in so many dimensions of psychology teachers' lives. And I'm going to highlight especially history of psychology and also high school teaching. And so I'm just really grateful that you finally got worn down enough to say yes, and the check is in the mail.
All right. I'm happy to be here.
Okay.
Ben, I have the feeling that all the nice things that Jane's about to say to you today, I'm going to just guess that that's not your favorite place to be, or do you like hearing the praise and the and the effect that you've had on so many people?
Takes up too much time.
Yeah, we'll see if we can get this into 15 minutes for you. Well, let's start here. Thanks again for doing this. And
Sure.
I know so many teachers of psychology that are probably just about 10 years ahead of me in their careers, whose lives have been influenced and touched not only by you professionally, but just by who you are. And so it was really special to come in here and meet you today. I've seen your pictures. I told you that. You look just like your pictures do. So that's good. But yeah, just to see your pictures and then to be able to just chat with you a little bit today about your history. You've given so much to us regarding the history of psychology, and Eric Landrum and I have we say that with this podcast we have become accidental historians of the teaching of psychology, and so it was really important for us to sit down with you. So thanks again. Jane, do you want to just start in? I think if it's okay with you, I'd let you lead on this, because you all have this rapport that goes decades back.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
I mean, I didn't want to out you there, but all right.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well, I think let's start with, why did you become a professor?
Okay. So when I went to college at the University of Texas, I was 16. I wouldn't turn 17 till the end of the first semester. And I planned to be a doctor initially, and that was my father's influence. But the most important thing in my life at that time was golf, and I played on my golf high school team, and I played every day, 7 days a week. And I didn't want to be a doctor, really, because in those days, they made house calls and did other things and delivered babies at 2 a.m, and I didn't want to be out on the 15th tee, maybe one over, and have to go fix somebody's gallbladder. So I decided I'd be a dentist, and I thought I could control my hours more as a dentist. I could run my practice. You didn't have as many emergencies there, and I could quit by 2 and be on the links. But then organic chemistry suggested I shouldn't be a dentist. So I was looking around for something that would still allow me to have a profession, but without much work, so that I could play a lot of golf. And I looked around and I thought, college professors, they seem to come in at 10 a.m. and they teach a class, and then they go play handball for an hour, and they have lunch, and then they have an office hour, and they teach another class, and they're gone by 2. And I thought, wow,
a good deal.
That's really a great. So I decided I'll be a college professor, and I did that. And I think since I made that decision in 1970, I played golf maybe 8 or 9 times. So something
didn't quite work out. Something
went wrong. I found there was more to do than I thought there was to do. So, yeah. So,
well, and the irony is that you now live in a community that's on a golf course.
I do. As I sit here right now, I look out on the 12th fairway, and
and you still don't play golf.
I don't play,
but You do collect golf balls.
On Monday mornings, the course is closed today, and it's Monday, and usually I walk 2 to 3 hours on Monday morning in the rough collecting golf balls, and in 11 years now here in Charlottesville, I have 12,700 of them. And I've given about 8,000 to First Tee, which is a charity that Tiger Woods started, and I give the really pristine ones to my friends who play, and the really bad ones I throw at squirrels and rabbits in our garden.
And so why psychology?
My senior year, well, I decided it was one of the courses I had done well. Actually, anthropology was my first love. And I loved the anthropology courses I had. I had almost enough for a major. I had a professor that was just the best lecturer I ever heard in my life. I took both of his undergrad courses. One of my books is dedicated to him. And, but I worried about job opportunities if I was an anthropologist. So I thought psych would offer me more, and I liked my psych classes as well. So that's what I did. My senior year, I took a perception class from a brand new faculty member from Stanford. And I loved his class. It was he was not a very good lecturer. He's deceased now. Clark Burnham was his name, and we stayed friends all of his career. He wasn't a good lecturer. He was very nervous, but every day in perception class, he brought some demonstration to class. And in perception, there are a lot of demonstrations you can do, and I can remember a lot of them that he did. So he was using active learning back in a time when I don't know that people used that term, and this would have been in the 60s, 65, 66. So I liked his perception course. So I thought I'd get my PhD in perception, which is what I went to graduate school and did. I got my PhD in perception, but I found that he taught this phenomenological, gestalt-oriented perception course. There was nothing like perception had evolved to be. So perception had become very much interested in metrics, form metrics, a lot of mathematical modeling and perception. The boring stuff. And I thought, God, this is not what I thought perception was about. So I got my PhD. By that time, I was married. We had a child. I took a physio course. I loved physio, but I couldn't change. I already had too much invested in the perception track. So I got my PhD in the subject I really didn't like very much. I didn't like at least the way it was at that time, which was a terrible thing. Went to this little small college and taught that course. Had no ideas about research. I didn't, outside of my dissertation topic, which was mostly given to me by my mentor, I really didn't have any research ideas at all. And then I discovered history of psychology. I'd always been interested in history as a kid. And I took to that course and eventually changed that as my focus. And that was my identity, my professional identity. Never did a thing in perception. Don't have a single article, single publication.
It's interesting that your focus changed so dramatically given what your training was. But I think the experience that you had with the active learning strategies led to, I think, one of the articles that had the greatest impact on that generation of learners, where I think the article was something like, you can do active learning in large classes, stop kidding yourself.
Right.
Yeah,
right,
very
right,
powerful article.
Right. Yeah, no, Burnham was, he was an important influence, and one of the, toward the end of his life, he died of cancer. He was a longtime smoker, really a wonderful guy. I was invited by Jamie Pennebaker, who was chair at the department in psych at the time, to give a talk at the University of Texas. This was when I was at A&M, just a couple hours away. And I went over to Austin, and he was in the audience, and this was maybe 2 or 3 years before he died. And I got a chance to give him a real shout out, which I had done through letters and other. He knew how I felt about him, but to be able to do it with him in the audience was really very special. But yeah, and active learning was a huge part of the way I taught intro psych, and I taught perception for a number of years too. And so that was what I did there too. I
think one of the things that came through in that article is your ability to make small communities within large classes, right, so that it felt intimate.
Right.
And you also had some strategies for learning names.
Yeah. Well, it was easy to, when I started at Nebraska Wesleyan, where I taught 10 classes a year, and those were small classes. And so it was easy to learn those names. Very different when it came to A&M. But one of the things I did at A&M, well, I'd say there's sort of two parts to my life. I was at A&M, Texas A&M for 32 years. And in the beginning, I taught intro, which was 200 to 300 students. After about 10 years of that 32 years, I created a Nebraska Wesleyan curriculum for me. I taught only honors intro, 24 students max in a class. So all my classes were small. I taught graduate courses, which were usually under 15. And I taught an undergraduate history that might be 60 or 80 students, but mostly I had small classes. I required all of them to write an autobiography, which they gave to me the second day of class. I gave them my autobiography the first day, which was a single space type page. And I told them the kind of things I wanted to know about them and, what you do in high school, what kind of activities, tell me a little bit about your family, whatever. And anything you're not comfortable sharing, don't. And that was a way, and I would read those. I always loved reading those, and really getting to know them. And I would, sometimes they would say things that I would be able to shape my lectures a little bit for. If it wasn't, I could say, Julia, you mentioned in your autobiography that you had this relative and so I would do some of that.
That would be stunning for students to experience that.
Well, I think at A&M where they were in so many big classes, it was a big deal. We had those small classes over, and this came from the Nebraska Wesleyan days. We had all of those small classes over for a dessert reception or a barbecue in the backyard or something. All of the years I taught at A&M, and I can't tell you how many senior undergraduates who said it's the first time I've ever been in a professor's home. And at Wesleyan, they would have never said that. I mean, that has been very common there. The first professor's home I went to as an undergraduate was Clark Burnham. Invited me when I was a senior. And when I was working, I was doing some research with him. And after his perception course, which I'd taken in the fall, and I was doing research in the spring, and he invited Priscilla, my wife, and I over, and he offered me a beer. I didn't drink beer, but I drank that beer. I drink beer now. I don't want to sound like Brett Kavanaugh. I like beer. But anyway, that's the only professor's home I ever went to in my undergraduate days. So big classes, I couldn't learn names. Steve Smith, a colleague of mine who was is a memory guy. He had a lot of mnemonic strategies that allowed him to learn 250 names, but I never mastered that.
Ben, were these kind of student engagement strategies that you use, did you pick those up from anywhere else, like from other people, or were they just things that occurred to you that if we're going to create a learning environment, these are the sorts of things I need to do? I need to get to know these students. Right.
Well, I don't think the autobiography, I don't think that came from anybody that I remember. So when I was I told Jane some of this earlier when we were visiting. When I went to Nebraska Wesleyan, I was really disappointed that I was there. I mean, I had no publications as a new PhD. Well, I was ABD. I didn't finish my dissertation until that first year at Nebraska Wesleyan. But I was disappointed. I felt like a failure to be there. Harvard and Stanford hadn't sent me invitations to join their faculty, and it was ridiculous that I would have expected that, but I sort of did. And coming out of TCU for my graduate work, which wasn't one of the premier programs, although I think I got a very good education at TCU. Steve Davis, we had some great folks in our classes, actually, Dwayne Simpson. Anyway, I had a bad attitude, and I had a mentor there, 15 years older than me, Cliff Fall, who became one of my dearest friends and a father figure in many ways. And we had 1-year contracts, and I thought if you're at a place like Nebraska Wesleyan, it's because you're a failure. I mean, you wouldn't be there unless you just weren't very good. And I didn't like being there, and I'm sure I showed that. I don't hide my feelings very well, as Jane could tell you. But Cliff was he saw somebody worth saving. I don't know if I want to use that word.
You actually mentioned yesterday that you wouldn't have rehired you.
I wouldn't. I would have fired my ass. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I believe that was the language you used.
I absolutely would have, because we had 1 year. Why not get somebody better?
Who wants to be here?
Who wants to be here? Yeah. So anyway, it took me a while, but I learned the value of the Nebraska Wesleyan community, and we went to basketball games and baseball games and art shows and one-act plays, all the student activities. This was Division III, so none of these were scholarship kids except academic scholarships, and it was what was expected of you. You were part of the Wesleyan community. You would do these things out of the sense of loyalty to your students. And I enjoyed doing this. I had Dean DeBoer, a psych major who could hit three-pointers from the corners, just deadly. There wasn't a three-point line in those days, but he was something. Or Willie Sapp, this wonderful collegiate wrestler who made the most beautiful pots in ceramics that he would display in the art shows, or Amy Bertelson in drama. And it was a great place. So when I went to Texas A&M, I had this 2-year interval at APA Central Office, and then I went to A&M. And of course, I'd never been part of a graduate program as a teacher. And I would see people with their doors closed, faculty with their doors closed, and they would take a writing day, or they wouldn't even be in for the day. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And I suddenly realized why those places, it was so much easier to focus your attention on your graduate students. Those were your small classes. Those were the students you got to know. I had 300 kids in intro psych, multiple choice, Scantron exams. A student could walk into my office and have 3 A's on the exams, and I wouldn't even know who they were. In fact, I remember a young woman who came in, and she had my intro psych class, and she was, I think, a senior. And she wanted to go to graduate school, and I said, well, what are your GRE scores? She said, what is that? And
oh dear.
I thought, well, this is probably not a very good. I said, well, what's your grade point average? She said, it's a 4.0. And at Nebraska Wesleyan, that would have never happened.
Right.
And that student would have been pulled out early. Hey, how would you like to do some research with me? I have a library project. Would you like to work on that? So it took some adjusting to the A&M culture. And so that was why toward the last 20 years of my stay there, I really tried to create what I had at Wesleyan in terms of small classes. And one of the things I noticed was, in the early days teaching those big classes, I would go to the mall shopping and, hi, Dr. Benjamin. Hello, Dr. Benjamin. That ceased after I lost those big classes because I didn't have enough of those students anymore, so I didn't get recognized in public the way I had been. But I love the small classes and getting to know the students that way. So the autobiography thing was a big thing, and I used it a lot of ways. There was a student who was killed in the bonfire collapse that killed 12 students when I was there, a horrible event. And he was a senior psychology major, and I had his autobiography because he'd been a student 2 or 3 years ago, and I just hadn't thrown them out yet. Anyway, I thought, well, maybe his parents would like to have it.
Oh, my goodness.
Turns out I read it and decided they wouldn't like to have it. It had to do, I'll just say it had to do with alcohol and his love of alcohol. And he was one of the ones the toxicology report showed was right. Anyway, the autobiographies were just a wonderful way for me to get to know who they were.
Yeah, very powerful.
It sounds like it played a powerful role for students too. And that's kind of what I'm taking out of this is it can be a safe place to be in a safe classroom with somebody that you can disclose things to that maybe these are young people, right? They're in my classrooms, I get 16, 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds in my classes. And it might be the first time that they kind of feel an amount of independence and where they can share themselves in that way. So, yeah,
I remember remember one young woman in reading her autobiography. She said, "My father committed suicide about 2 months. She was a beginning freshman. My father committed suicide early this summer, and this was now September. She was in school and beginning her freshman year, and I asked her to." Surreptitiously asked her to come talk to me, and she did, and we had a very nice conversation, and she cried, and we talked about, I said, how many courses are you taking, and getting a sense of how she was handling the load that she had, and she would become one of my favorite students. I remember lecturing one day, and I was lecturing on something it wasn't emotion arousing by any, and I look at her, she's in the second or third row in the class. This is an honors intro class, and the tears are just streaming down her face. And I know she's a million miles away. There's not anything I've said. It's not anything I'm talking about. It's just, she's gone to that place again with her dad. Anyway, I kept in touch with her the whole time she was a student. I invited her to do some history research because I often publish with undergraduates in history, and I asked her, and I said, Katie, I want to tell you that going to graduate, because she wanted to get her PhD, I said, doing history research with me will not be as good as doing, say, clinical work, because she wanted to be with one of the clinical faculty. So you need to know, I'd love to have you. I'd love to work with you, but so she talked to one of my clinical faculty, says, you understand, you work with me, you'll work with really a graduate student or supervisor, you'll never see me, you work with Ludy Benjamin, you'll see him all the time, you'll be mentored by him and so on, but you need to make the choice. And she did. She chose the clinical. Probably when I was okay with that, it was the best choice for her. Anyway, they would often reveal things in there that helped me. I was not a counselor. I didn't try to play that role at all. I just tried to let her know that I was glad to be aware of her situation, because I think about how I would have reacted to that. Well, what's going on with that crying at this point. So they were very useful to me from a teaching perspective.
Yeah.
You've been retired now for.
Retired in June of 2012. Yeah. So we're just starting our 12th year here in Charlottesville.
So I'm curious about what you miss about the teaching life, if anything. Because I will share that I was in the audience at NITOP when you gave your last presentation and you announced, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And I thought, that can't be right.
Yeah.
And you kind of proved that you were right.
Yeah. No, so I retired in 12, and the last 2 years I was department head, and it was not a good experience. I had a dean who made life tough for everybody, and me especially. So I went out with not a good feeling about my 42 years as an academic. I was glad to get out. There was changes, and you can't be in a business for 42 years and not expect change, although I do. I'm like most people. I don't deal with change easily. I like things to stay the way they are. I want cell phones to go away. I think they're a horrible invention. I don't think that's going to happen just because I'd like them to go away. Anyway, I was ready to go. I'd made that commitment to Doug Bernstein for January of 13 for NITOP, and I wasn't going to back out of that. But I closed the door when we moved here in June of 2012, and I didn't give another talk. That's the only talk I've given. That's not true. I've given a couple of talks to the Charlottesville Stamp Club. But I can excuse those.
On the history of stamps, I imagine?
One, actually, based on an article I wrote, Why Psychologists Can't Get a Stamp. But
a psychologist did get a stamp.
Lillian Gilbreth, is the only PhD psychologist I know of anywhere in the world who got a stamp. But of course, America would have to admit that there are mental health issues. There have been a number of, I won't go into this, it's too long, but there are a number of people. Tipper Gore was one of the last I remember who pushed mental health stamps to try to get a series or a single mental health stamp. And there are at least actually Dave Pittenger wrote an article about this because he worked for one of the congressmen for California when he did an APA fellowship on the Hill. Dave worked for this congressman who tried to introduce a bill to get a psychology stamp recognizing the value of psychology to public service. The short story, there have been 8 or 9 bills that have come forth. They've all been killed in committee. They've never made it. So you'd have to admit that there's mental illness in America if you started talking, and we can't admit that there's mental illness. One time, the 2 top, this is back when the Soviet Union was around, the 2 top Soviet psychologists, they had an academy of psychology, and it was the director and the deputy director, and they came, I was working at APA, and we had a luncheon for them. Chuck Kiesler was fluent in Russian from his Army days and military intelligence. And so we had a lunch at APA. It was catered, and I'm sitting across from Dick Kilberg, one of my colleagues, and somehow the subject of mental retardation came up. That was a label in those days. And Dick said to the director, how are mentally retarded citizens in the Soviet Union treated? And he says, we don't have mentally retarded citizens in the Soviet Union. And Dick said, oh, come on. And I think Mike Pallett kicked him under the table at that point. So anyway, I think that's how America look. We keep talking about, well, the guns issues, for example. Well, it's not guns, it's mental. We need to do more for mental health, but we don't. Mm-hmm. And we can't even put a stamp out there that alerts people to the fact that there are mental health issues, and it's okay to seek help if you have mental health issues. So
what prompted you to go to APA to do that service there? When you were at APA working with educational affairs?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
It got me out of Nebraska Wesleyan, where I was starving.
Okay. Because you were being paid private school salaries, and you were a father.
I was the lowest paid assistant professor in America. I'm convinced of that. In fact, Priscilla was a stay-at-home mom in those days. We had 2 daughters. I remember we were $28 a month away from qualifying for food stamps. And I remember telling Cliff Fall, my department head, who I said, I love that man. I told him, just know, when we qualify for food stamps, I'm alerting KOLN TV, and I'm going to hold a press conference on my step, Nebraska Wesleyan professor on food stamps.
Do you remember what your incoming salary was?
$9,000 when I started in 1970. Wow. Yeah. And some of my graduate student colleagues, I remember one of my fellow graduates made 14-something at Ypsilanti. What is that? Eastern Michigan, I think. And there were others. Nobody's salary was mine. And they stayed low. And Vance Rogers, who was president of Nebraska Wesleyan, was great at getting buildings. We had an incredible campus. We got a brand new building that psychology was housed in 75. And we had 26 laboratory rooms, all well equipped. With the Olin Foundation endowed the building and the equipment funds. And we had an undergraduate laboratory that would have rivaled anything in the country. But faculty were a dime a dozen. Dr. Rogers, the president, made that clear.
Wow.
And if you didn't like it there were 10 people waiting to take your place. So I needed to get out. Okay. And I also was becoming more interested in writing and doing history research. And with 10 courses a year, I couldn't do it there. So that's why I went to APA for 2 years. I was amazed that Chuck Kiesler hired me. I wrote a letter saying I don't think APA does anything for people like me at a small liberal arts college who basically teach.
I think that was true.
And it was true. But I thought, that'll be sour grapes. But I said it. And I later, I think it was Cliff Fall's letter, my department head's letter, that got me the job. He wrote this amazing letter. Chuck told me this. He wrote this. He said, you're a workaholic. He said, we needed workaholics at APA. That's what we wanted because people work 60, 70 hours a week. That's what was expected of you. And so anyway, I got that break, and I did my 2 years there, but I wanted to be an academic. I knew I had to get back to the classroom. So, could you talk about the accomplishments that you were able to do while you were at APA in that role? Certainly, my office, education, was responsible for continuing education, which I knew nothing about, graduate education, which I knew nothing about, accreditation of doctoral programs in clinical counseling in school, which I knew nothing about, and undergraduate and high school psychology. So those latter two, I felt like I knew a little bit about, and those were my interests. And the staff member who was in charge of that was Kathy Lohman, a good friend, sadly, who died two years ago this month. And Kathy and I edited the first volume of the Activities Handbook. One of the things, so we started the Activities Handbook series. That was a good accomplishment. Started the G. Stanley Hall lectures. That actually was my idea. I'm not sure it was a good idea, but the idea was you would bring master lectures in to talk about their fields with the idea that it was oriented to, if you're teaching learning in your intro psych class, here's kind of an approach you might want to consider. Here's some of the newest cutting edge stuff that can get folded into your lecture. So that was the idea of that. We boosted visibility of the high school group. That would eventually lead to some other good things. And I learned a lot about those other areas I didn't know anything about because I had to work on those as well. I spent a lot of time actually working with the VA, which was the Veterans Administration, which was trying at the time to cut psychology internships. And VA was the major employer of clinical and counseling students in internships. This is during the Carter administration, and his head of the VA was Max Cleland, who was a triple amputee Vietnam vet.
I remember him.
And you think, God, if any time you needed more psychologists in the VA, it was in the aftermath of Vietnam with so many problems that those vets dealt with. But they were trying to cut the internships by a quarter, so by 25%, which was a huge reduction. And so I probably spent one day a week working on VA issues. I just, because this is an interesting story. So Chuck Kiesler, my boss, the head of APA, wanted to have a meeting with, it wasn't going to be with Max Clean, it was going to be with a guy named Crutcher, an MD. I can't remember his first name, but Crutcher was the chief medical officer of the VA and the guy who held the purse strings. And so he wanted a meeting, and he wanted me to draft the letter that would go to Crutcher. So I wrote this about a 3-page letter, which is a long letter. You don't usually write letters that long. That trying to set up a meeting. And he said, there's a woman in the VA you need to meet. Her name is Dana Moore. And Dana Moore turns out PhD in clinical from Dickinson, Texas, which is right down the road from where my folks live. So I knew this little town she was from. So I was told the letter will get to Dana. It'll go over to Crutcher, but he'll pass it down for Dana to respond to your letter. So I called Dana, who I didn't know, and we arranged to meet at a dark corner of this restaurant in a table by ourselves. And I've got my draft of the letter, and I've got 2 copies and one for her to look at. No, if you ask me this way, I have to answer this. You don't want to do that. You want to ask it this way, and then I have to say this. And you don't put this in. This needs to go, and you need to say something here. So she wrote all over the letter, and I went back and rewrote my letter, and I gave it to Chuck. He signed it. It went over to VA. A week or so later, Dana called. She said, I have the letter. Arrived on my desk today. We eventually got the meeting, and the VA internships were saved for both of the years I was there, but they were lost the year after I left. And didn't work out. And the guy who saved them, saved APA's internship, but both years, was Daniel Inouye. And his chief of staff, you may remember, was Pat DeLeon, who was APA president years later. Anyway, Pat was very pro-psychology, and he was able to get Inouye to stick language into the bill, which restored those cuts, Senate Appropriations Committee. Yeah.
So,
but the idea that one of the things you learned, you didn't sign anything you wrote in Washington, and you didn't write anything you signed. That was the message. So here, these 2 lowlifes, one in the VA, one in the APA, are carrying on this highfalutin conversation. So for a rube from Nebraska, it was kind of a big awakening.
That is an achievement, though.
Washington politics. Yeah.
Is the exposure that you had to high school psychology actually occurred as a function of taking this position at APA?
No, I'd actually had some interactions with high school psychology teachers in Lincoln, and I'd gone out to lecture in a few of the classes when I was there, mainly about sleep. I'd had an interest in sleep, and so I would go talk about sleep and dreaming to the high school teachers. There were 4 high schools in Lincoln at the time. I think I spoke at all of them. And then when I got to APA, of course, one of the things I began to learn was that APA had been lobbying the college board to get an AP psych test, and that the college board just kept saying no every year, that high school teachers taught it as an ESP and touchy-feely and nonsense course, and it wasn't really a science-based.
What's your favorite color?
Yeah,
what does that mean?
So there was that kind of resistance, and we psychology banged on the door for 20 years before they let us in the club, and now look at AP Psych. So it took some convincing. I knew there were high school teachers out there who could teach a college level course, and so did a lot of other people, but College Board didn't seem convinced. So anyway, I started that. Rick Cashow had been at APA, and he had done a lot of that lobbying. He was a major force in trying to get APA in the club with no success, and it just took time. It took a lot of time banging on the door until they finally, maybe out of just, God, the only way we're going to make these people go away is to give them what they want. So they did.
Yeah. You mentioned yesterday when we were talking that Rick was an important force, but you also talked about Sheila. And a lot of the listeners of Psych Sessions are AP readers. Right. So they probably don't know who Sheila was or what contribution she made to that tradition. Could you talk just a little bit about Sheila?
So I got the phone call after the College Board had approved. I got the phone call. I don't remember if it was ETS or the College Board who contacted me about being chair of the committee, of the first AP Test Development Committee. And I knew, or maybe they told me who was on there. I was surprised that Rick Cashow wasn't on there. I thought he deserved to be on there, and he wasn't. They told me Greg Kimball was on there. Greg, I now know how AP works, and when they're starting a new exam, they want the biggest name they can attract to give the credence to that exam. So I figured that Greg had said I'll be on the committee, but I'm not going to chair it. And he was incredible on the committee. The high school teachers just loved him, and the college faculty as well. So anyway, I got picked to chair this committee with Greg sitting as one of the college members. And Sheila was, first time I'd met her when we convened that first meeting. She was she had a bachelor's and master's, I think, both in history from Cambridge or Oxford. I forget which now. She was a Brit. I've used this word maybe too much, but I feel I make connections with people in a strong way. I love this woman. And I know she liked me a lot, and I know her looks. I have a wonderful picture of her where she's giving me this look of, which you can't hear on the podcast. You just have to envision
pursed
this.
Lips, furrowed brow.
Pursed lips look of like, you need to back away from that, or you need to you screwed up there, guy. She was a terrific mentor for the committee. She was well experienced. She'd run other AP programs at ETS, mainly history, and she knew what had to be done to get a new exam off and running. She let us have run in doing what we needed to do, but was not afraid to jump in and say, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I felt when sometimes I see people talk about AP Psych, I often see my name mentioned there. Well, he chaired the first committee. I almost never see Sheila's name there. And Sheila Egger was huge in getting, I can tell you, it might not have happened, or it wouldn't have happened as easily or as smoothly as it happened if we'd had somebody other than Sheila in that job. I kept in touch with her. She died a few years ago, but she was just a terrific person.
Yeah, I had a chance to work with her my first year as an AP reader, and she was impressive.
Yeah. She would come to when we ran the high school teacher institutes in College Station at A&M in the summer. For about a 4 or 5 year period. She would come every summer to represent ETS and the AP exams and so on. And she was always a delight there. I remember we took her to one of the famous Texas barbecue places where they bring your meal out on butcher paper. And it's slices of brisket and an onion and a big piece of cheese and a pickle and a big butcher knife. There's no fork. There's no, why would you need that? And bread, white bread. You have to have white bread for barbecue. I'm now living in a part of the country where they don't know about barbecue. And I that's one of the things I miss about Texas is good slow cooked brisket. Anyway, she was just, it was like, where have you brought me? She was very formal. So one other story. So the AP committee was meeting in Atlanta, and we'd done a workshop there actually for high school teachers, and I wrote on one of my cards. I wrote on the back of my card, "Do you realize we're a few miles from one of the best 5-star restaurants in America in Buckhead, Georgia, outside of a suburb of Atlanta?" And I passed that to her. So we went to that restaurant for dinner that night. The bill was exorbitant, and so Marjorie Biddle was what he told me about it. Sheila had to do all of this fancy fudging on the meals to make up for that, to be able to get paid for that. But that's a kind of, she just was great to work with.
Why did you take on the burden challenge of the high school institutes? Because that was a big deal back then.
I wrote my first NSF grant when I was at Nebraska Wesleyan. It was my last year there. I got NSF funding. It was for $14,000 and something for a 2-week institute at Wesleyan. And I went to the project directors meeting. That's where I met Sam Cameron, who had one at, as it was then called, Beaver College. And Sam was so smart and so good at telling college professors how to work with high school teachers and how not to work with high school teachers. And then I got the APA job. And so I managed to get NSF to let us keep the grant at Wesleyan. And so my colleagues Cliff Fall and Marty Klein ran the institute that summer. So then when I went to A&M in 80, we did one in 81, another one, one summer in 81. And then I don't know why, but I do know why. It was with the AP course coming online, I worried that we might not have as many teachers to teach AP courses as I wanted. So I applied and ended up with 5 years of funding, 91 to 95. And I told you I've written some memoirs just for me. They're not really memoirs. They're not focused. I call it chapters of my life, but just written about things that were important to me. And I say in one of those that those high school institutes were the best years of my life, my professional life, without a doubt. And I couldn't be, Randy Ernst and Charlie Blair Broker would be the two names that would come to mind, because Randy was my right hand, my assistant manager, my bench coach for all those years, and then Charlie was there every year. But Margaret Davidson, Nancy Grippo, Mike Sullivan, Nancy Grayson, Joe Lamas, Marisa Sarabondo, Kristen Whitlock, just really amazing.
Some pretty amazing people.
Amazing, and I've left out a bunch. There's Alan Feldman, lots of people who were very special. And I learned a lot about teaching. I used to tell people, if I had a graduate course to train graduate students how to teach, I'd hire Charlie Blair Broker to run that course, because he could tell them how to teach better than I could or anybody else I knew. So when I thought back, there was a lot of work for those. God, there were a lot of work. And those teachers would endure a month in College Station in July where it was 100 degrees every day. And they would say, well, why are we having it here? I'd say, well, that's because that's where I work, sadly.
But they loved the experience.
It was an amazing experience. It really was. I would, all during the year at conferences, SWPA, MPA, EPA, I would hit up the publishers and I would say, you got a perception book that I know that's coming out with a new edition this year. I need 35 copies of your old one, the one that's going out of print. So when they would come, we would have 30 books to give them. We always have 3 intro books. One of them was always mine, Jack Nation, mine and Roy Hopkins and Jack Nation's book, which was current then. and usually Doug Bernstein's book and another one I can't remember at the time, maybe Dave Meyer's book. So we give them 3 intro books, but we give them books on abnormal psychology and personality and development and so forth. And we had, at the end of the institute, we had Boxing Day. There was always somebody with a pickup, usually somebody from Texas who was there with a pickup, and we'd buy cardboard boxes, and we'd take a couple hours out, and everybody box their books and mail them home. And we'd have postal runs to the post office to mail all those books. But talking to WGBH we had door prizes every Friday at the end of the day. Drawing everybody's name would be drawn on Friday. There would be a prize for everybody every Friday, and we had some big prizes like a full set of the 26 half-hour episodes of the Discovering Psychology video series, and I don't know, other kind of things. And I would go around and talk to various vendors at APA and other places. And just, the application process, the advertising, the lining up of speakers. We always had guest speakers like you, Jane, who came in, and many, many others who were so good.
It really was my introduction to high school psychology.
Was it?
And getting to know that particular group of people that you identified, I consider many of them some of my closest professional friends,
right,
and have very vivid memories of being able to be part of that enterprise. Grateful for it.
Right.
Rob McIntarfer had me out to Bellevue, just across the lake from Seattle, to participate in one of those days with high school teachers, and I witnessed them getting the books, and I couldn't believe. You take it for granted, I think, as a college professor who gets sent books all the time, right, because people want you to adopt them. Now, for you to go to publishers and say, hey, you're not going to get anything out of this, really. These high school teachers are not going to buy 30 books from you, but we're going to ask you to do something good. It's still happening today. Right. So I love the legacy of that, because I've heard from those teachers, they love psychology, but their access to kind of the latest of what's coming out, the latest editions, is just really, really difficult. Right. So anything that they can get, they're just so excited to get.
Well, this was before the internet, really. Yeah. And right. So to have a library in your classroom, yeah, so the student who was interested in development or personality or perception or learning or whatever, there's a book there in the bookshelf, in the teacher's bookshelf, that they could go to. So, and for the publishers, sometimes we've got current editions, but more often we got editions that were just being replaced. The intro books were a different thing. Of course, they were hoping that they would adopt one of the 3 books, the intro books, and the intro books were always current editions that we used. But yeah, it was it was the hardest work to put those on and to make them come off as well as they did. But a lot of that was the high school teachers there, and I remember an incident. One of the teachers one of my closest friends at A&M was Jack Nation, who sadly died at 59. Alcohol poisoning, had been in rehab many times. Maybe the best teacher I ever saw. He got student evaluations I would have killed for. My evaluations were good. They weren't on his scale at all. And he had $1 million in federal grants every year for the research he did in neuroscience. And he was the total package in a university, and he loved teaching. When we reduced our teaching load at A&M, he wouldn't cut his teaching load. He stayed with the courses. We went from a 2-2 load to a 2-1. He wouldn't do it. I so admired it, and he was the 3rd author with Roy Hopkins and me on our intro book. Anyway, I always had Jack lecture on learning to the high school group, and he was talking one day about the Wagner-Rescorla law, and somebody asked him. One of the teachers said, "Can you tell how that's derived?" And so Jack went to the board and derived the law across 3 blackboards. And I remember Charlie Blair Broker telling me later, he said maybe 3 of us were hanging on till the end. Everybody else had dropped out on board number 1. But he didn't think we weren't up to it. And he didn't say, no, you're not going to understand what that's about. He went up there and did it. And not to show that he could do it. That wasn't Jack. but because they'd ask and he wanted to answer their question. That's the kind of guy he was. Huge loss to me and to my department and to psychology and his children and everybody else.
Well, I would love to talk about your intro book, but I think maybe more important to spend our remaining time talking about history.
I don't want to talk about the
Okay, well, then we won't talk about the intro book.
I told you, I didn't like being identified as an intro book author. It was not who I was. And once the intro book came out, the intro book was to help pay private education for 2 daughters in college, and it did that. But I resented being introduced when I would go give talks on history, which was what I was about. This is the writer, a very successful. It wasn't very successful. That was David Myers. God, David Myers would have been a guy you could have just hated because he was so damn successful. His book came out the same year mine did. But
he's just so nice.
It could not have happened to him.
It's true.
David is a terrific guy. We have a great friendship, and he's done more good with his money than I would have done had I had that success. So that was good. He made it. But anyway, I didn't like being thought of as an intro book author. I thought I was other things than that. Now, I don't mean to disparage that. It just wasn't the way I perceived myself.
Can I ask you a question to get into this history of psychology stuff? How long did it take you in your career before you really became comfortable identifying history of psych as your strength, your area? Because you were doing all these different things.
Yeah, so I started publishing. I came to Nebraska Wesleyan with no publications. My first publications were in history. So I came to Wesleyan in 70. I published 2 articles in 75, a couple more in 77, one in the American Psychologist. And it was sort of off and rolling on that. When I came to A&M in 80, there were 3 programs, IO, clinical, and experimental. And so I affiliated with the experimental. That was my training in perception. And there was no place for a historian in that triad. So I wanted to hold on that identity and actually I published a couple of studies. I had a sleep lab briefly, and I published a couple of studies on sleep. But I masqueraded as an experimental psychologist. I never had the chops for that at all. And I can tell you that I was 40. I turned 40, so that would have been 1985. So 5 years after I'd been at A&M, my department head was Steve Orshell, and I was doing sleep research. I had some graduate students working with me in the sleep lab, and I went to Steve and the 2 of us in his office, and I was ready with all kinds of arguments. I said, "Look, I just turned 40, and I had this kind of a midlife crisis moment, and maybe 40 is too early for midlife, and I don't want to be an experimental psychologist. I want to do history, and that's all I want to do." And I was ready with all of these arguments that I'd worked hours on. He says, "That sounds fine to me." He says, "Students are not going to work with you." And I said, "No, I've thought about that. I know that." He said, "Well, if that's what you want to do, do it." Well, but wait, argue with me. I came loaded for bear here. So anyway, that's when I kind of committed. It was hard for me to give up the experimental identity because I didn't feel like I had a home at that point. And as it turned out, I didn't for a while. And then experimental split into areas, into neuroscience and development and social and cognition. Those 4 areas. Well, I sort of fit in cognition, but I really didn't. But I was starting to write a lot of history about IO. So I joined the IO group, and I joined them because they were the nicest people in the department. And I thought I'd like to be with the nicest people in the department.
So you could have written about any.
I had a real strong interest in applied psychology.
Sure.
I really liked the story of how in the beginning of the 20th century, really, you have a number of psychologists who began thinking about how can we use this for public good. And initially in advertising, and other psychologists who began to supplement their academic salaries with these consulting gigs, and then psychologists who go out into full-time practice, a lot of them women, because when they got their PhDs, they found academic jobs few and far between, mostly at women's colleges and not much else. So a lot of the early women who worked for Aetna Insurance, I'm forgetting names here now, Marion Bills, I think, anyway, there were a lot of women psychologists who found jobs applying psychology in business, consulting, education, etc. So I wrote a lot about beginnings of educational psychology, clinical psychology, and especially what it was called in those days, business psychology.
Do you have favorites that you like to talk about?
In history, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
I would say two that come to mind in the sense that you feel like you've given recognition to somebody who was previously ignored. So Harry Kirk Wolfe would be one of those. When I began to write about him, he really, no one had his name did not appear in any place except in a book I had, Virginia Sexton, Henry Misiak's book. They had a table listing once American students, and most of those I recognized, like James McKean Cattell. But there was one that said H.K. Wolfe, and beside his name was Nebraska. I'd never heard of this guy, but I'm in Nebraska. And it is Nebraska, so maybe and most of my students come from Nebraska. Maybe they'd like to learn about somebody who had studied with Wundt, the founder of psychology. So that's how I went to the archives. I'd never been to an archive. Went to the archives at Love Library in Lincoln and found some very interesting papers that he had left from he founded the lab there in 1889 and was there until his death in 1918, except for a brief period when he was fired and then hired back. So to meet the kids later in Seattle, they were in their, Isabel was 90 something, and Harry and Catherine were in their 80s, all living in the Seattle area. This in 1981 when I contacted them. And to write a biography that gave their father visibility, a man who had been persecuted wrongly, tried for disloyalty in what was called the Reign of Terror in 1918 in American universities, where anybody who had German ties through their spouse, through their education, were suspect. And, of course, he'd taken his PhD at Leipzig in 1886. So I met the grandchildren. I knew all of that family. Harry Kirk Wolfe III was at the time a professor of philosophy at Portland. And so to give them, here's a book, and to now see, a lectureship named after him, a laboratory named after him, he pops up here and there in books. The other one would be Inez Beverly Prosser, first African-American woman to earn a PhD. Bob Guthrie, who was a dear friend. One of my books is dedicated to Bob. Bob had written his classic book, Even the Rat Was White, which is just a terrific read. And he has a series of one-page biographies of the early African-American psychologists. And on the left-hand page is a photo, and the right-hand page is a one-page biography. And I'd read about this woman. She was born in Texas, and so I had this kind of connection. I was born in Texas. I was living in Texas at the time. And I thought there's got to be more than a page about her. So I called Bob and I said, Bob Guthrie, and I said, is there more you know? He says, not really. He says, I'll send you the family correspondence that I have. And I said, are you okay with me pursuing this? He says, absolutely. Just, go to it. So I did, and it was a long process to try to dig things out. We found copies of her dissertation, copies of her thesis, some articles she'd written in Mississippi for a Black Teachers magazine. There was I'm blocking on the name now, it was a Rockefeller Fund. Rockefellers put up money for minorities to go to graduate school. And she applied for one of those grants and got it, and went to the Cincinnati where she got her PhD in psychology. And that foundation still has its records. I got a copy of her application, which was an amazing document about why she wanted to go there, what she wanted to study, what she wanted to do. So little by little, we pieced her life together. And There was later a University of Cincinnati. Sean Bediaco was the fellow who put it together. He had read my article and knew the Cincinnati connection. So on the 75th anniversary of her PhD, Cincinnati hosted a 2-day session honoring her. And I think 11 of the Beverleys and Prossers came, all of whom I knew, including Bernice, who was Inez's baby sister, many years junior. And then Inez was just terrific, and I have many fond memories of her. I'm sorry, Bernice. I have many fond memories of her. But to now see this woman get recognition who never appeared in any of the books, and she's now in a lot of books, if nothing more than a sentence or two, but she's there. And Francine Prosser, who's a niece of Inez Beverly Prosser, great niece, I guess, told me a story. She said, I can't remember if it was her daughter or anyway, one of the Prosser family members had her intro book, and she was taking intro psych, and she looked and she saw Inez Beverly, and she went up to the instructor and she says, "That's my great great aunt." It doesn't get better. It doesn't get better than that. And if you think so part of it was that. The other part was meeting these amazing people. The Wolf kids, 90s and 80s. They were delightful people. Well, I interviewed Isabel I interviewed all of them in Isabel's house in Seattle, and she was the matriarch of the family, clearly. And I remember we sat in two stuffed chairs, Isabel in one, me in the other, and the arms were torn up by cats, and stuffing was kind of coming out of all the arms. They were really tacky. And on either side of my chair were books stacked up almost like end tables, 2 stacks of books. And I said, "It looks to me like you read a lot of books." And she said, "Well, my eyesight," she says, "I read about 20 a month now." She said, I used to read a book a day," and said, the bookmobile lady knows what I like, so she comes by once a month and takes the ones away and gives me about 20 new ones, and I usually get through those. So throughout my several days, I would interview her a couple of hours a day. So over the course of the several days, she would say things like, "Have you read that book on such and such?" And I'd say, No, ma'am, I haven't." Do you take Omni magazine? Boy, there was an article in there last. And no, ma'am, I don't read that. She must have thought I was the most unread, ignorant person she'd ever met in her life. She'd had an interesting career, which is too long a story. Was a lexicographer, and really responsible for a lot of the work on the Thorndike Barnhart Dictionary. Was one of her accomplishments. Been a social worker in the Pueblo areas of New Mexico and Arizona. Really a fascinating life for that woman. All of his kids, all of Wolf's kids did well.
Well, I know we're probably close to out of time, but sometimes psych sessions can give you a platform for causes that you believe in. And it seems to me you might want to say something about Akron.
Yeah, I would. So the University of Akron houses the Center for this is the Cummings Center for the History of Psychology, which houses the archives of the history of American psychology, which is where I sort of started my career. And I spent 3 weeks there in the summer of '75, going through all of these boxes of incredible documents, and I published a number of articles in history as a result of that first experience. But it is unique as a facility in the world. There's a full floor museum of psychology. It's the National Museum of Psychology. It's a Smithsonian affiliate.
It's thrilling to walk through it.
The second floor is offices and some manuscript collections and archival rooms, and a beautiful reading room that is named for Charles Brewer and Marjorie Suze Brewer. And the beautiful Sipo mahogany tables and chairs in that room were crafted in this shop right here. Mm-hmm. Well, the heavy lifting was done at Fred Dotson's shop in Charlottesville, but when they were ready to be, we did a lot of the grunt work here of sanding and routing but anyway, I had worked at those tables, those crummy pine tables that wouldn't have brought $1 in a garage sale. And I told Dave Baker, who was the executive director, you need some really classy tables there. And if you look, you can't find tables like this. The tables like this are not made today. They're made. They're laminate. They're formica covered. They're not solid wood. They're not solid oak like this table.
You can tell this is a woodworker talking.
Yeah. So I roped in a friend here who's much better craftsman than I am, and he said, "Yeah, let's do that." And then we got Fred Dodson, who's really a master cabinet maker, and so these tables are gorgeous, and I take credit for the idea and only a little bit of the work and kind of insignificant work at that. But there's 6 beautiful Sipo mahogany tables in there and chairs as well, and it's a pleasure to go in that reading room and sit, and I've done that a few times. And then the top 2 floors are called the Institute for Human Science and Culture. And there are permanent exhibits and rotating exhibits that are up there. There's a really nice Native American collection that's permanent and some rotating things, and they always have interesting stuff. They have a museum certificate program. Students generate projects, and those are on display usually. Anyway, if anybody is close to Akron, Ohio, there are good reasons to go there, and one of them is to see the museum and to see what's there. The paper collections is unrivaled anywhere in the world. They have the manuscript collections of maybe 400 to 500 people now. And so Kurt Lewin's papers are there, Lita and Harry Hollingworth's papers are there, Abraham Maslow's papers are there, Kenneth Spence's papers are there.
And they wouldn't turn down any donations people might want to make.
They do. So Kathy Fay, who's the executive director, makes the call on that. They have limited space and limited processing time. In fact, they have so many collections. They're several years behind on processing their collections right now. Check them out online. Center for the History of Psychology. They have what are called 5-minute lessons, 5-minute history lessons. There are a number of videos. I think there are about 8 now. There's one on Bob Guthrie that I mentioned. There's one on Harry and Lita Hollingworth. There's one on Ruth Howard, who was an early African-American psychologist. So it's worth donating to if you have some spare money. If you have something you think is unique in psychology that ought to be preserved, it's the place it should go.
And that's where your chapters will go.
They're already there, as a matter of fact. Yeah, my chapters of my life. They have the Milgram Shock Box, which is there. They have several of Bandura's Bobo dolls. They have the prison door, one of the prison doors from Zimbardo's. They have the warden's guards' uniforms and other things like that. Lots of wonderful artifacts. Harlow's monkey heads. The IQ Zoo materials, Washoe. A lot of things have come in from Alan Gardner now on Washoe. So it's an amazing place, and too many people don't know about it. And they usually have an exhibit at APA or APS meetings. If you're there, come by the booth and say hello to the people and learn more about the center.
Jane, you've been out there a few times?
I've been out there once, and ironically, the visit that I was making with Missy Beers, actually at her teaching conference, the deal was I would come to do the keynote talk if she would make sure I could get to the museum. And when I arrived, Ben was there. And so I confess I didn't see as much of the museum as I would like because I had time with Ben, but what I saw was just so amazing. And as a teacher of history, something that Ben inspired me to do, just so meaningful.
Yeah.
To be there with him that day without it being planned was a miracle.
Yeah. I can't wait to get out there someday. I think PsychSessions needs to go out there and report from there, and maybe conduct some interviews there, and then also maybe submit some of these episodes that are that would fit well at that museum.
So I know you're trying to close out, but I'll do this as quickly as I can. So it is a repository.
There's no rush.
It is a repository of amazing things. David Boder, who founded a psychology museum in Chicago in the 30s at Lewis Institute, later Illinois Institute of Technology. And his papers and memorabilia came to the archives, to Akron. And one of them was he got a grant in 46 to go to Europe. He was Latvian. He spoke about 11 languages or so. He went to Europe, and he went around to the various displacement camps where a number of the camp survivors had been put before they were being relocated. And he went around to these camps with a wire spool recorder, which had been invented at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, and he recorded his interviews with these people. And later he published a book called I Did Not Interview the Dead, which is based on 8 of the interviews. Akron has all of these wire spool recordings. John Indris and other people off of eBay and in parts stores created a recorder that would play those, and they was about to have been digitized.
Oh my goodness!
And there was a tape that was lost. They knew from the log that this was from a camp called Hennenville, and they knew the tape existed, but they couldn't find it. Turns out it had been mislabeled, and John found it and recorded this tape. And there is this wonderful singing by this woman who's being interviewed of the songs that they sang in the death camps. And so it got a New York Times story. Judy Woodruff featured it on PBS. It got lots of play. Dave went to Cleveland because there's a group of Holocaust survivors in Cleveland that's getting smaller every year. And he was asked to come up and talk to them. And he took the tape with him, the recording with him. And he talked about the center and Boater and what had done. And he says, I have the music here. I have the tape if you want to hear it. He wasn't sure he wanted to play it. He wasn't sure they wanted to hear it. And they said, we'd like to hear it. So he starts playing this song, and a guy sitting there starts singing along, and then another one, and they're standing up, and about a half a dozen in the room are singing this song. Dave said it was maybe one of the most magical moments of his life. That's what's there. There used to be a program, I remember the name of it, The Naked City. There are a million stories in The Naked City. That was always the closing line of this TV program. There are a million stories in The Naked City, which was New York. This has just been one of them. And that's the way I think about Akron. There are a million stories in those archives just waiting for somebody to come and tell them.
I want to thank both of you for sitting down to do this interview. And Jane, there's just... I would never have gotten from Ben what you pulled out of him because of such familiarity and friendship over the years. So what's it like for you now, just at the tail end of this, to interview Ben as we're closing out?
Finally.
Yeah.
Because it took us a while. Very gratifying because I see Ben as the advocate for why history is still an important function, that students really should learn the history of psychology, and it's disappearing. And so any opportunity to provide a platform to talk about the significance, why does this matter? I wanted to make sure that we had some kind of representation in PsychSessions, and so I'm grateful that you did this.
Well, I'm glad to do it. I'm glad I relented.
Me too.
She wrestled me to the ground, actually. She got me in an illegal hold, I think. But
she's the only one who could have done it. We knew that early on. So thanks for wrestling him to the ground.
It was my pleasure, and it was hard to do.
Thanks, Ben. It was great to meet you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
If you are enjoying the PsychSessions podcast, we want to invite you to support us. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can do it by going to wherever you listen to PsychSessions, whether that is on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and leave a review there. You could also make a donation to PsychSessions. PsychSessions is a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization, and we can issue tax receipts if you want to give. Just go to psychsessions.org and click on the donate button. Thanks for your support and for making PsychSessions free professional development for teachers of psychology.